1300 BC, two great empires battle for regional dominance. A powerful people called the Hittites and the mighty Egyptians. This is the story of Ramesses, a brash young pharaoh whose bold military tactics and strategies put his life and his empire in grave danger. The fate of Egypt and the entire Middle East hangs in the balance when the two forces collide at the Battle of Kadesh, a battle of deception, treachery, and raging chariots. At Kadesh, 17,000 Hittites face off against 20,000 Egyptians. Both forces fight to expand their borders and ultimately control the Middle East.
The Battle of Kadesh represents one of the most important battles in antiquity. It represents a clash of major empires, the Hittite Empire and the Egyptian Empire, in a crucial zone of military operations around Kadesh, which is in modern Syria.
Egypt is located in northeastern Africa. The Hittites' homeland, called Hatti, is about 1,000 miles away in what's now Turkey. But this battle between the superpowers rages in between the two homelands, in an area called Amurru in modern-day Syria.
The Amurru is the ancient world's crossroads. If you want to trade, you need to travel through the Amurru. If you want to attack someone, you need to travel through the Amurru. And if you want to prevent attack, you need to control the Amurru.
The Hittites are led by a young king named Muwatalli. Believed to be in his early 30s, Muwatalli is known for his cleverness in battle. The Egyptians are led by Pharaoh Ramesses II.
Ramesses II is the son of Seti I, who was one of the great warrior pharaohs of Egyptian history. Now, Ramesses comes to the throne at about age 22, 23, and sees himself in that long tradition of warrior pharaohs. Indeed, like the great warrior pharaohs who preceded him since the establishment of the Egyptian Empire 200 years earlier, Ramesses sees himself as actually the personification of the Egyptian military tradition to accomplish two things. One, to make sure that Egypt never again is threatened, that Egypt is safe, and secondly, to expand the borders of the empire against Egypt's enemies.
The bad blood between the Egyptians and the Hittites has been brewing for centuries, since both empires were in their infancies. Egypt emerged around 3200 BC as a collection of feudal settlements along the fertile Nile River Delta. Over the course of several thousand years, it grew and spread, but remained at peace with its neighbors, which had its advantages and its disadvantages.
The advantage of having a country that's prosperous and at peace for so long is it becomes incredibly well developed in terms of the arts, engineering, architecture, painting, poetry, and religion. It's amazing from that perspective. The disadvantage is the world is spinning on around you. New technological developments are occurring, and you're not part of that deal. And as long as you don't have to interact with the outer world, it'll work. What happened in 17th century or 1650 BC is the Egyptians got the rudest surprise of their life.
The surprise is an attack by northern invaders called the Hyksos. The Hyksos come from the city-states of Canaan and Syria. These northern invaders sweep into Egypt on a bloody path of destruction.
Egypt was almost hermetically sealed from the greater influences of the outside world, so the invasion came as an incredible shock. It shook Egyptian society to the core and changed it forever.
The Hyksos occupy Egypt for nearly 80 years. Finally, the Egyptians rebel and fight a 30-year-long war of liberation. They eventually succeed in driving the Hyksos out, but the northern influences remain.
One of the positive consequences of the occupation of Egypt by the invaders from the north was the transfer of their superior military equipment into the Egyptian army.
The Egyptians adopt the use of new hand-to-hand fighting weapons and a new way to maneuver around the battlefield, the two-man war chariot. But the Egyptians not only use the chariot, they improve it.
The Egyptians essentially made three major changes to the chariot, which revolutionized its application in warfare. The first of these was to move the axle and wheel from the center of the chariot, as is the case of the northern invaders, back to the rear of the chariot.
The axle is about 3.5 feet in length, set back as far as possible for greater balance, speed, and maneuverability. The chariot's cab is about 3 feet wide, 1.5 feet deep, and 2.5 feet high. The frame is made of wood, steam-bent ash or elm, covered with animal hide or reeds. The floor of the cab is made of flexible layers of leather or specially woven cloth to help the archer balance and absorb shock. The Egyptians also replaced the Hyksos 4-spoke wheel with a 6-spoke wheel. This seemingly simple change made for a much stronger wheel, a wheel better able to withstand speeds of up to 12 miles an hour along bone-jarring, uneven terrain.
And probably one of the most amazing technological innovations was the creation of what's called a U-joint, where the pole of the chariot coming off the horses joins the cab of the chariot.
Because this joint is able to move and isn't locked in place, it can absorb a lot of shock. This not only ensures the integrity of the chariot, but it makes the ride more stable for the men inside.
You put this all together, and you end up essentially with the Egyptians having changed the machine to such a degree, it would be the equivalent of essentially having a superior modern main battle tank on the field.
The chariot represented a huge step in warfare because it brought mobility to war. And of course, it also became a sign of status. If you were a nobleman, you wanted to be a chariot warrior.
The individual chariot squad consists of 3 men. The driver navigates the horse and machine across the battlefield. The archer must be skilled enough to launch arrows from a moving platform at speeds of up to 12 miles an hour. The runner runs alongside the chariot. He serves both an offensive and defensive purpose.
As a defender, he protected his chariot from opposing runners, but he would also attack enemy chariots, dragging warriors out of their machines and slaughtering them. In modern warfare, you never send in tanks without infantry support. That's exactly what this is like.
The runner fights with the bronze sickle sword. About 3 feet long, the sword weighs approximately 2 pounds. It can be swung with enough force to slice off an arm or a head in one chop. The runner may also be equipped with a 6-foot spear. The shaft is made of wood, the tip razor-sharp bronze. After revamping their fighting force, the Egyptians develop a new strategy. Attack the enemy first, ask questions later. They would put this strategy into action some 30 years after their liberation from the Hyksos.
When Egypt had secured her own domestic position, had rebuilt her army, she turned to the north for revenge. And at that point, you have the formation of the Egyptian Empire and the beginning of its expansion to the north into Canaan and what is now Lebanon and Syria.
The Egyptians' quick and nimble chariots give them a great advantage as they spread north and conquer most of their enemies. But as they begin to spread into what is modern-day Syria, they come into contact with the Hittites, who are expanding their territory as well, and they also have chariots.
Egypt and Hatti are separated by nearly 1,000 miles, but both are threatened by one another, and both see the land between Egypt and Hatti as an essential buffer zone.
Initially, when you do that, the buffer zone is, of course, just that, a buffer zone that's expendable. It's not the homeland. But over time, what happens? The defense of the buffer zone becomes almost identified with the defense of the homeland. And so you end up fighting wars and wars in the buffer zone.
For centuries, the Egyptians and Hittites spill each other's blood in small skirmishes as they clash over incursions into the buffer zone. Sometimes it's an infantry fight, but other times, the chariots engage.
When people think about chariot warfare in the ancient world, what they imagine is lines of chariots either smashing into enemy infantry or lines of chariots smashing into another line of enemy chariots, okay? That's not how it worked. A little thinking will show you that horses will not charge against a phalanx of infantry spears, and there wouldn't be much point in trying to slam into an enemy chariot. More commonly, the way chariots were used when they were used against chariots was essentially in a kind of swirling combat. The lines would attack towards one another, but they would never really get in contact. The object would be for the archer on each chariot to pick off the archer or driver or horse of the other chariot. As they pass by, or in military terms what's called en passant, as they pass by one another. Then they would wheel around, whirl around, and come back at one another. Sometimes not at the same target, but picking the closer target.
While the two-man Egyptian chariot is light and mobile, the Hittite chariot is a larger, heavier, and slower machine. The axle is positioned in the center of the carrying platform. This reduces speed and stability, but allows a great advantage: the ability to carry a crew of 3. Now, the charioteer, archer, and runner can all ride together into battle. Some historians believe this innovation was developed years earlier after the Hittites defeated another enemy, the Mitanni, who had lived in the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In addition to ridding themselves of an enemy, the Hittites gained the famed Mitanni military horse trainer named Kekuli. Kekuli changes the future of chariot battle using a surprisingly simple technique.
What Kekuli did was to write a training manual on how to train horses to be stronger and able to pull heavier loads. This was huge because it enabled the creation of a completely new chariot and a new way to fight with chariots.
With two-man chariots, the runner had to obviously run alongside. This inhibited how fast and how far they could travel, because obviously the runner, who was the chariot's main defense, would be completely exhausted.
But Kekuli-trained horses were able to pull a larger chariot with 3 men inside. The Egyptians and Hittites have each improved and perfected their own chariots into lethal weapons. And after hundreds of years, the showdown between these two great chariot cultures will erupt when Pharaoh Ramesses meets his adversary on the plains of Kadesh. Two armies, the Egyptians and the Hittites, are on a collision course toward one of the greatest battles of antiquity, the Battle of Kadesh. Kadesh is located midway between the two empires in modern-day Syria. For many centuries, the Egyptians and the Hittites fight small skirmishes over this land because each believed the area holds strategic and tactical importance.
The skirmishes at the edges of both empires, the Hittite and Egyptian empire, just wax and wane on and off for about 30 years, and which no real conclusion is ever reached. They're just border skirmishes and not quite serious. But what happens while these skirmishes are going on is a very bizarre event, and that occurs inside Egypt itself, that will, in a very strange way, set in motion a series of chain reactions that leads ultimately to the clash of both empires at the Battle of Kadesh.
This chain reaction begins with the death of the famous pharaoh Tutankhamun in 1323 BC.
Well, Tut dies, And according to Egyptian law, his widow can choose a new husband. In Egyptian tradition, it's the female's bloodline that is royal, not the man's. So she can marry whomever she wants, even the commoner.
What she does in an act that by today's standards would be insane, it was actually regarded as insane at the time, is she writes a letter to the king of the Hittites saying, "Send me one of your sons. I will marry him, and he will be Pharaoh."
My husband has died, and I have no son. They say about you that you have many sons. You might give me one of your sons to become my husband. I would not wish to take one of my subjects as a husband.
Turns out that Tut's widow believes Tut was assassinated by his own subjects. For many years, Egypt was in a tremendous amount of internal turmoil between traditional polytheists, Egyptians who believed that the national religion should continue worshiping several gods, and monotheists, those who believed in only one god. It was a terribly bloody time in Egypt.
Civil war erupts throughout Egypt, resulting in thousands of deaths. Some believe King Tut is amongst the victims.
Now, at this point in Egyptian history, the polytheists had greater power in Egypt, and they were also enemies of Tut's widow. So what's their solution? Essentially bring down the empire, make a Hittite prince pharaoh. Absolutely incredible. The entire Middle East would have completely changed.
If the Hittites can absorb Egypt and her territories, they will control every trade route and every military launching point from Egypt to Mesopotamia. Keenly aware of the political advantages, the Hittite king agrees to the arranged marriage and sends one of his younger sons to Egypt. What happens next is the spark that ignites the Battle of Kadesh. Egyptian enemies of Tut's widow discover the marriage plan and ambush the Hittite prince. The Hittite prince never sets foot on Egyptian soil.
Eventually, Tut's wife dies. Some say she was murdered. But the bigger point is how the Hittites reacted to the assassination. As you can imagine, the Hittite king is furious.
The Hittite king is the great warrior Shupililiuma, and he's enraged. His desire to avenge his son's death motivates his resumption of war against Egypt. But this isn't the only reason.
Shupililiuma isn't stupid. He's not going to allow the death of his son to drive the empire's foreign policy. It is, however, a good excuse to start fighting again over the valuable Amurru region.
Shupililiuma leads his forces against Egypt for nearly a decade. But around 1322 BC, the Hittite king is killed. Not by the blade of an enemy's sword, but by an invisible enemy, far more deadly.
One incident in which Egyptian garrison was overrun by Hittite troops who took some prisoners and apparently transported the prisoners back to the Hittite homeland in modern-day Turkey. It seems, or at least there's some evidence to suggest, that some of the prisoners had been infected with some kind of a plague. And the plague not only infected some of the soldiers of the Hittite army, but spread throughout Anatolia and much of the Middle East, with the consequence is that the death rate was so high. Indeed, the king himself died of this disease.
After Shupililiuma dies, the skirmishes between the Egyptians and the Hittites slow down significantly. It is during this period of relative stability, around 1300 BC, that Pharaoh Ramesses II comes to power. Only in his mid-20s, Ramesses is a warrior king with a reputation for being brash and cocky. He understands that to protect Egypt, he must occupy the buffer zone to the north.
Ramesses comes from a military tradition, and he sees himself not only as the pharaoh of the period of time in which he rules, but as a continuation of that tradition of great warrior pharaohs that has come into existence since the Egyptian Empire was formed 200 years earlier. So when you look at trying to get inside of his head, what you're looking at as a person who sees himself not only as a great warrior, but a man whose primary function, primary purpose, primary reason for existence is to protect Egypt.
5 years into his reign as pharaoh, Ramesses launches an attack against the Hittites. He leads 24,000 soldiers north up the coast road toward Gaza. His force is divided into 4 divisions, all named after Egyptian gods: the Amun, the Ra, the Ta, and the Seti. Each division is made up of 6,000 soldiers, 5,000 infantry, and 500 two-man chariot teams. The Hittites learn of the Egyptian movement and immediately counter with a force of about 17,000 who travel south from Hatti. Their general is the grandson of Shupililiuma, King Mawatali. Like Ramesses, Mawatali is also a battle-hardened warrior.
We don't know much about Mawatali, but the text suggests he was a good thinker. He fought with his head and had a good strategic mind. He went into these battles with a game plan, and he stuck to it. In many ways, he was a perfect foil to Ramesses.
Both forces are heading toward the city of Kadesh. While controlling the city is not the end goal for either army, whoever controls Kadesh will have an easier time conquering the entire Amaru region. Kadesh is built atop a small rise near the mouth of the Orontes River Valley. The city is surrounded by casement walls, 2 50-foot-high parallel walls, each about 400 yards long, roughly the length of 4 football fields.
The important thing about Kadesh is that its walls are faced with limestone. And although its walls are casement walls, its walls are faced with limestone. Why this is important, and very important for 200 years of the Egyptian attempts to push the Syrians and the Hittites north, the problem was they couldn't take the cities. And the reason why they couldn't take the cities is because the battering ram, the effective battering ram against stone, was unknown. It did not make its way into the Middle East until the 8th century.
Ramesses wants to get to Kadesh first, so he can avoid having to attack the stone-walled city. But when he finally does reach the city, he is in for the biggest surprise of his life. The Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II leads 24,000 soldiers to attack the Hittites. They are on their way to the Amaru, a strategic buffer zone between the 2 empires. Near the town of Byblos, Ramesses divides his force. He personally leads 3 divisions, the Amun, the Ra, and the Ta, up the Litani River. These 18,000 soldiers will approach the strategic city of Kadesh from the south. He sends 6,000 of his troops, the Seti division, north along the coast. They'll cross the Lebanon mountains and approach Kadesh from the northwest.
What Ramesses intends is essentially a pincer movement against the city. The larger force up the valley comes in this way, and what happens coming from the west is a smaller force at the city of Kadesh. So that's the strategic plan.
This is a massive undertaking. Ramesses' army takes up 15 miles of road on the march at 4 abreast. Some 4,000 mules and donkeys are needed as transport. Each soldier requires 3 pounds of grain made into bread each day, 8 to 9 pints of water.
On a march like this, lasting over a month, about 17% of the manpower would be lost to sprains, broken bones, lung infections, things like that. It's quite a feat to move an army of over 20,000 men some 500 miles and arrive in fighting condition.
After a grueling 40-day march, Ramesses and his 3 divisions make camp 10 miles south of the city of Kadesh, near the forest of Rabawi.
But to say that Ramesses' 3 divisions all camped together isn't quite accurate. Yes, they all stopped at the same time, but there are a lot of troops. So the guys at the back were 15 miles away from Ramesses in the front.
Ramesses is now pretty deep into the Amaru, and the Hittites could be anywhere. Whether he fails to send reconnaissance scouts up ahead or they don't discover anything, Ramesses has no information as to the Hittite whereabouts.
Near Ramesses' camp, Egyptian patrols capture 2 local Bedouins, hoping to learn the location of the Hittite army.
We know from temple inscriptions that Ramesses had a pet lion that he took with him on campaigns. It's been suggested that the lion was used to, how should I put this, encourage cooperation.
According to the Bedouins, Muwatalli and the Hittites are still 100 miles away to the north of Kadesh at Aleppo.
Now he sees an opportunity. Kadesh is defenseless. I can grab it, I can use it as a logistics base, rebuild my army, get everybody rested, and then we're just a short step up the road to confront the Hittite army.
Ramesses is so excited that he jumps on his chariot with his bodyguard and starts for the city of Kadesh. But here's the problem. Ramesses, in his youthful enthusiasm, takes off, and his army is spread out over 15 miles behind him.
The Amun division quickly gathers its stuff. It's not in battle-ready conditions. It's slung over its shoulder at any time, and it starts boogieing up the road, trying to catch these guys.
Ramesses begins to make camp on the plain. The unprepared Amun division slowly catches up to him. The Ra is strung out a few miles behind, and the Ta is still near the forest of Rabawi. And the Seti division is somewhere on the coast of the Mediterranean.
Ramesses thinks it's a walk in the park. His bodyguard starts building the camp. Elements of the Amun division just begin to arrive in the camp. Everything's kind of disorganized. The Ray division is route stepping it across an open plain, and Muwatalli springs the trap.
From orchards south of the city emerged 2,000 Hittite chariots.
They burst out of the orchards, take the Ray division right in the flank. Bang!
Just imagine turning to see thousands of Hittite chariots. Even for a trained army like the Egyptians, it would have been utterly terrifying. Ramesses' Ra division is absolutely laid to waste by these chariots.
They're not battle ready, they're not formed for battle, they just get hit and they scatter all over the plains.
The Hittite charioteers navigate the chaotic battlefield while archers launch their missiles with deadly accuracy.
Chariot archers and their drivers worked as pairs. That is to say, they trained together, and their horses trained together, on and off, hour after hour after hour.
Both Hittite and Egyptian archers use a composite bow made of wood, horn, and ox tendon laminated together.
A composite bow is an awesome weapon. It has a very high penetrating power and deadly accurate in the hands of a good archer.
Some archers will join the runners on the ground and join in the infantry battle. Some historians believe that the Hittite king Muwatalli is already inside Kadesh and has orchestrated this surprise attack. The Bedouin story, a lie. Ramesses' army, blindsided. Muwatalli's plan, brilliant. In 1279 BC, the Battle of Kadesh begins. A vicious Hittite chariot ambush against an unprepared Egyptian force draws the first blood of the conflict. And it's all Pharaoh Ramesses' fault.
Pharaoh, in his haste, took off practically by himself. He's only got maybe a couple of hundred soldiers with him.
Bedouin spies gave Ramesses false information, that the Hittites were 100 miles to the north at Aleppo, when in reality, they were already in the city of Kadesh.
It never dawns on anybody that maybe somebody, like the Hittite intelligence officers, put the Sashu Bedouins up to the story, namely that this is a classic piece of intelligence deception to lure the Egyptian army into a trap.
As Ramesses sped off to claim the city, he left his force unprepared and strung out behind him for 15 miles. At the same time, 2,000 Hittite chariots stealthily made their way south along the east side of the Orontes River, hid in the orchards, then smashed into the Ra division.
One of the things that happens on a battlefield is as tactics and situation changes, what happens is, if you're not careful, you let operational success drive strategic goals. You start changing the goals. That's a basic mistake. And in this case, that's exactly what happened with Ramesses. Given the opportunity suddenly to grab Kadesh, he could hardly resist it. And he took it and fell right into the Hittite trap.
Some historians believe that the key to Muwatalli's successful ambush is the three-man chariot. Because of specially trained horses that possess greater endurance, the Hittite chariot can carry the charioteer, the archer, and the runner. This allowed the chariot force to travel the approximately 2.5 miles from the city to the orchard quickly, without exhausting the runners, the chariot's main defense.
Chariots aren't supposed to be able to move like this. The ancient world has never seen chariotry like the Hittites bring to bear at Kadesh. I firmly believe that the three-man chariot innovation completely changed warfare. And I really believe that at Kadesh, the Hittite surprise attack was directly related to this type of chariot warfare.
The surprise attack slaughters thousands of Egyptian soldiers. Ramesses watches the carnage from his camp. Ramesses is about 2 miles to the north of the ambush site. His only defense is the disorganized Amun division on the outskirts of his camp. About 15 miles to the south is the 3rd Egyptian division, the Ta.
And somewhere to the west is the Set division, who has come up the coast. So Ramesses is in real trouble because his army is so spread out.
Ramesses is getting pummeled. His forces are spread out. It's just chaos. I mean, if the Egyptians get to Ramesses, this could cripple the Egyptian empire.
And Ramesses is the Hittite chariot force's next target.
The Hittite chariots turn north and take dead aim on Ramesses' half-built, disorganized camp, where the Amun division is just stumbling into camp, trying to keep up. And bang! As they smash right into the camp, dismount from their chariots, and this terrible infantry battle erupts.
The Hittites maul the Egyptians. To make matters worse for Ramesses, many of his elite chariot teams desert the battlefield, abandoning their king in his most desperate hour. But suddenly, the Hittite advance toward Ramesses' camp slows. Instead of continuing to charge toward the Egyptian pharaoh, many of the Hittites stop and begin looting the camp.
But that's not even the real problem. The real problem is the Hittite infantry is nowhere to be seen on the battlefield, and that will prove costly.
10,000 Hittite infantry and 1,000 reserve chariots wait on the east side of Kadesh.
To have 10,000 infantry doing nothing doesn't make much sense. Muwatalli has Ramesses against the ropes, and he should commit his infantry to knock him out.
But Muwatalli does not deploy his infantry. Despite the slowing of the Hittite attack, Ramesses' situation is still dire. He has no choice but to take matters into his own hands.
Now, Ramesses is no weekend warrior or a spoiled prince. He's led his army into this trap, and he's prepared to lead his remaining troops out. So he and some of the elite infantry guard, and pretty much all that's left from the Amun division, march into the fray.
You know, people say he was a braggart or whatever, but he was one hell of a soldier. What he does is he rallies what chariots he has, rallies his army around them, and literally takes a section of the attack to the northeast, which probably was the weakest area, and attacks it.
Ramesses gathers momentum and begins to drive the Hittites back. But his forces are too scattered to make a significant impact. Muwatalli still has the advantage. He can end the battle by deploying his 10,000 reserve infantrymen.
Now is the time. You got him by the nose, kick him in the... Now's the time for Muwatalli to commit his infantry.
Muwatalli is about to make one of the most important decisions of his life. A decision that will determine the course of history. The fight between the Egyptians and Hittites has reached the most critical point of the battle. An initial chariot attack is turned into an infantry fight on the plains of Kadesh. This is good for the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses, as he is able to stop the Hittite momentum gained with the shock of the attack. If the Hittite king Muwatalli, however, makes the right next tactical move and launches his infantry, he can easily surround Ramesses, kill him, and in one swift stroke, conquer the mighty Egyptians.
Now is the time. You got him by the nose, kick him in the... Now's the time for Muwatalli to commit his infantry. Commit it across the northeast, commit it across the ford, northeast of the city, and it would have been all over. Chariots coming up from the south, infantry from the north. They got the commander. It's over. He doesn't do it. He does nothing. And so the Hittite attack bogs down. It's essentially trapped in the camp fighting an infantry battle. It's given away its advantages in shock and mobility. It's stuck in an infantry battle. He has a hammer fist of infantry and he doesn't commit it.
Muwatalli's failure to deploy his infantry remains a colossal mystery to scholars. Ramesses, however, is still in trouble. Despite being stuck in an infantry battle, the Hittites fight furiously. But Ramesses' luck holds.
At precisely the right time, marching down through the pass, across the Lebanese mountains, onto the plain of Kadesh, comes the second Egyptian force, the Seth Division, at the precise time to Ramesses' rescue.
Ramesses' Seth Division, which had been marching up the coast from Egypt, finally reaches Kadesh.
The Seth Division brings with it 5,000 infantry and 500 chariots. Ramesses now has the force he needs to push the Hittites across the Orontes River.
A great chariot and infantry battle rages on the plains outside Kadesh. But because of the crowded battlefield, the more mobile Egyptian chariots are able to maneuver more easily and get the best of the Hittite chariots. Ramesses has successfully turned the tide.
Finally, Muwatalli launches reinforcements, but not infantry. He sends 1,000 chariots.
Muwatalli's chariot reinforcements move south from the city, across the Orontes River, then head north toward the battlefield. But suddenly, they are attacked from the rear. It's the final Egyptian division, the Ta, and they are ready to fight.
Muwatalli, he forgot about the Ta division. Now, I mean, it's got eyes. There's a hell of a battle raging over there. We better not cross the plain in route step. They're in battle formation. And they're marching up on the plain just as the Hittites cross the Orontes and turn their back to them. Bang! They hit them in the back and shatter the Hittite reserve force.
The Hittites are caught in a vice. Ramesses, what's left of the Amun division and the Seth division battle in front. The Ta division attacks from the rear.
Muwatalli committed a grave error, and that is never throw good forces after bad. If you're going to use forces, you do it to exploit a victory. You never do it to stave off a defeat. And he did it for the latter reason.
The Hittite chariots cannot escape. They have Egyptian forces on both sides of them, and they can't maneuver because they're right in the middle of Ramesses' half-built camp.
2,000 Hittite chariots are lost, and Muwatalli has squandered an overwhelming advantage. But despite Ramesses' ability to turn the battle around, the Egyptians have also suffered badly.
Most of the Amun division is probably dead. A good part of the Ray division is killed, certainly scattered. So he lost half his force. And a goodly number, at least two divisions of organic chariots, just 1,000 machines, maybe more. So it's been a bad day at Black Rock all around. The sun sets on the battlefield, dead and dying horses and individuals screaming.
The Hittites retreat toward the base behind Kadesh. The Egyptians don't try to chase them.
In the morning, Muwatalli sends a message to Ramesses, like, this has gained no one anything. Let's just mutually disengage. We'll fight again another day. Ramesses accepts. He has no choice. He has no hope of moving north of Kadesh.
But that doesn't stop Ramesses from claiming himself the victor. He engraves depictions of a great victory at the Battle of Kadesh on monuments throughout Egypt.
Ramesses records the Battle of Kadesh as a great personal victory, and of course, we have multiple sources in the archaeological record, so we know that he exaggerates. But if you consider that he ultimately saved himself and his army from what could have been complete annihilation, his version of the truth makes some sense.
Before Ramesses heads back to Egypt, he takes care of one final piece of business.
Ramesses assembled the chariot commanders of the units that had broken ran under attack, forced them to kneel in the dust with their hands tied behind their back, and personally beheaded some of the sons of the most powerful nobility of Egypt.
It's a bloody finale to one of the bloodiest battles of ancient times. And Ramesses makes sure that his army knows the price of failure.
Ramesses learns his lesson from the mistakes he made at Kadesh, but his flaws are all too common to history's great generals.
George Armstrong Custer fell into a similar trap as Ramesses did at Kadesh. He was chasing a group of Indians when he failed to detect the main force. Having driven off the smaller group of Indian raiders, he got ready to attack what he thought was a defenseless and small village. To his surprise, an enemy of greater strength took him on the flank. Unlike Ramesses, Custer was killed, but the mistake and the tactics were the same.
The two superpowers continue to fight over the strategic buffer zone for several years after the Battle of Kadesh. But in 1262 BC, the Egyptians and Hittites are forced into an alliance to combat a growing threat from what is now Iraq, the Assyrians.
And that alliance lasted for almost a century. So in the same sense, perhaps like the Battle of Berlin in World War II marked the point where two superpowers met and essentially tolerated one another because they couldn't shove the other fellow off. Same thing is true of the Battle of Kadesh.
The Battle of Kadesh might not have been the overwhelming victory that Ramesses would have his people believe it was, but it tells the story of a brash young monarch who rushes into war, finds himself outsmarted, but claws his way back to save himself and his empire.
Hello, first tonight, a warning from the police in Luton. An estate where a drug dealer was gunned down is at tipping point.
Richard Long, who was 23, was murdered at the beginning of September on the Lucy Farm estate. But witnesses to the shooting have been hard to find. The police say help is needed to drive out a dangerous criminal minority.
7 weeks since Richard Long was shot dead. 2 have been charged, but police are struggling.
There's clearly an area where somebody else could have got caught literally in the crossfire of this incident.
They fear local people don't have the courage to deliver convictions.
It's a choice now that people need to make. Assist the police with this inquiry. There have been 2 arrests and 2 people charged, but we need people still to come forward with key and crucial pieces of evidence.
10 days after the shooting, 14 people were arrested in drug raids, the result of months of planning. But local people aren't convinced.
They've not been here for years and years and years to help. We've got junkies that are selling on the streets, that are picking up drugs in front of our children, up at our local communities, hounding old people for money. There's stabbings, there's shootings. It's just, they've not been here, because if they were here, this wouldn't be happening. The only thing that you'll get is a PCSO that will come and knock at your door, write a form, a bit of paper, and then it'll be buried.
Yeah. Any problems?
Yes.
Go on. We've got maybe 20 youths around the area that will cause antisocial behaviour, minor criminal damage, and then I'd say a handful of about 3, 4, 5 that, you know, will do a little bit worse, but that makes the whole estate look bad.
There's some very positive results have taken place. 14 people were arrested for drugs warrants, firearms have been recovered, and in fact there's been a 16% reduction in crime year on year this year.
But even today, deals were being done in broad daylight, drugs found literally on the street.
Well, I've just spoken to the grandmother of a 16-year-old who witnessed the shooting. She did talk to police, but then cried for 24 hours afterwards and was in such a state she had to go to the doctor and be put on medication. Apparently her mother says there's no way she'll be giving a witness statement.
But these are the people police need to help them help Lucy Farm. Nikki Jenkins, BBC Look East.
And if you can help the police, you can call the incident room on 01707 355 666. Or you can call Crime Stoppers on 0800 555 111.
A pensioner said today he's prepared to spend the next 20 years fighting to stop his clifftop home from falling into the sea. Peter Boggis has already spent nearly £500,000. Natural England says the erosion at Eastern Bavance in Suffolk should take its course, and today Mr Boggis lost an important judgment in the Court of Appeal.
We lost.
Peter Boggis says he may have lost a battle, but he hasn't yet lost the war.
And I'm not worried. I know where I'm going. I intend to carry on fighting.
Since 2002, he's been trying to protect houses at Eastern Bavance near Southwold from falling into the sea. Until he was stopped in 2005, he dumped 250,000 tonnes of building waste at the foot of the cliffs. He didn't get planning permission, but he paid for it himself, £450,000.
I've always thought that if you had a decent shovel and the will, men can move a mountain. The effect of me putting a sea defence in since 2002 has saved over 8 acres of land and 4 properties. This was done without any cost to the nation, and it is something I'm proud of.
Natural England made the area a site of special scientific interest 3 years ago and wants the cliffs which contain fossils to erode naturally for scientific reasons. This was challenged successfully by Peter Boggis in the High Court on the grounds it would have threatened a wildlife area. Now the appeal court has quashed that ruling. His options now: take it to our Supreme Court or the European Court. All the time, the cliffs are eroding.
Instead of being 50,000 tonnes there now, there should have been 250,000 tonnes, supplying sediment for further along the coast without the loss of our cliffs and property.
The Court of Appeal said the only lawful course now open to Peter Boggis was to apply for planning permission for his defences. But he has other ideas for the future.
I reckon I've got another 20 years to live, and I should quite possibly fill a lot, by the looks of things, fill a lot of that time in the court as well. But that doesn't worry me at all. To keep the grey matter moving in your old age is something that you need to do.
Well, earlier I spoke to Sean Thomas, the Regional Director for Natural England. I put it to him that this was just a technical victory over the need for planning permission. They hadn't yet won the argument over the sea defences.
I think we need to be very clear at the outset what the court case was actually about. It definitely was not about whether Peter could defend his home. What it was about was whether we were right to, and did we do it properly, in identifying the area as one of the best geological sites in the country. We're very pleased that the court found in our favour. It is indeed one of the best geological sites, and we were right to notify it as we have done. The issue of Peter's coastal defences, how we can go about putting them in place, is one that we now need to focus upon.
But Mr Boggis says that if he does have to try and get planning permission, you will argue forcibly that he shouldn't have it.
It's very nice for Peter to anticipate what we may say. We've been working with Peter over the last 9 months to see if we can find a scheme that would be acceptable to the geological interests and would also meet the needs of people who live down the coast, because obviously their beaches benefit from the erosion that goes on in front of Peter's home. So we're working very closely with them and Waveney District Council and the Environment Agency to see if we can find a scheme. If, of course, we still felt it was damaging to the interest, it would be the role of the local authority to balance all the different needs, including those of the local community and the environment and the people down the coast, to see whether the scheme would be acceptable or not. And that's the route we really do urge Peter to go down.
Is it right that you should use taxpayers' money to fight taxpayers when all they're trying to do is protect their land?
As Natural England, a statutory environmental body, we're there to identify the best wildlife sites in the country, and indeed that's just what we do. There was obviously a challenge there by Peter to whether or not we had undertaken our job properly, and we're pleased that the court found in our favour.
Mr Thomas, thank you very much.
The European Commission says it has no intention of blocking the expected takeover of Vauxhall. It means the final hurdle has been cleared for the takeover by the Canadian parts company Magna.
Last night we reported how thousands of NHS staff in this region are planning to refuse the jab for swine flu. And experts worried that if doctors and nurses said no, the rest of us could follow suit. We asked for your views. Joel Mapp has been going through your calls and emails.
I've come here to the Norfolk and Norwich University Hospital because we've been contacted by one woman whose husband is a patient here. She'd like staff to wear badges identifying whether or not they've had the vaccination. This would give patients the chance to say if they wanted to be treated by staff who hadn't had the jab, she says. Jennifer also got in touch with us. She's shocked to hear members of the medical profession not having the jab. She thinks it's selfish to put others at risk just because they don't want any potential complications. And the Conservative health spokesman Andrew Lansley, also the South Cambridgeshire MP, has also waded into the debate.
It's true to say that the government, I'm afraid, has a vaccine approval process, a recommendation process that isn't as transparent and doesn't expose to independent scrutiny vaccines in the way that is done for other medicines, and I think that should happen. But I don't think there is any reason to believe that the licensing process for this swine flu vaccine is other than robust, and that therefore it should be regarded as safe and effective for people to use.
We've also been contacted by a number of NHS workers who wanted to remain anonymous. One is a nurse in North Norfolk. She says she wants the vaccine, but she's been told she'll have to come to Norwich to get it. She doesn't think, therefore, any staff will bother with it. NHS Norfolk, though, has since told us that details of the swine flu vaccination programme still are yet to be finalised. And another nurse got in touch to say she won't be having the vaccine and doesn't know anyone else who will be. I don't believe what they're saying about testing, she says. I don't think there's enough evidence. Thank you for all your comments, and I should say that the health authorities are still advising all staff to have the vaccination.
Well, still to come tonight, Tom